Hello, y'all. This is the summary for the readings of November the 15th that were discussed November the 15th. The first one was In Spite of Women, about the magazine Esquire, the magazine for men Esquire, and specifically the period from its inception in 1933 to 1946. Things to think about, and this is something to think about for all these articles and for all of your readings overall. How do they all connect? How is it that these ideas about women that Esquire promoted, basically that women were inferior to men, which is why all of a sudden there was a need for a magazine for men that talked about fashion, that talked about the home, and by the home I mean, decorating, cooking, and all of these domestic duties that were and still are originally considered women's sphere. Why did they do that? Historical reasons. 1933, what was going on? What was going on as far as gender? What was women's roles in the 1930s all of a sudden during this period? And why did it threaten men? What about consumer culture and the economy? Also, Eleanor Roosevelt, why is she pivotal to this? What is she emblematic of? What is she an icon for? And why was she considered, in a sense, the exemplar, the model of the threat against masculinity? Okay? How did Esquire promote its masculinity? There was a need to promote and to highlight the masculinity of Esquire and of its readers, because Esquire was a magazine about shopping, and shopping was always and still is considered a very feminine domain. So they had to be hyper masculine. And as we have seen consistently, the way that men highlight their masculinity is by demeaning women. Okay? So think about that. How did they demean women? What about the whole idea of promoting beautiful women as objects to look at, as objects to leisurely look at? The whole idea of leisure. How did they present class? And how did they present power, not just authority, but also power as something that is represented by the fact that, we men have the authority and the power to look at these women who work so hard to be so beautiful? How does that play into later images of women that we talked about on the 15th? How does it play into the next reading? How does that play? How does this whole construction of Esquire's masculinity then eventually evolve into what Katz discusses in his construction of advertising the construction of masculinity? Katz being the gentleman, by the way, you saw in the video Tough Guys. There's a continuity to all of these ideas, and they keep evolving, and they keep getting bigger and bigger and more out of control. How does that masculinity of leisure, of power, of authority, and having that power and authority to demean women and have it be socially acceptable, okay, how does that connect with what Katz is talking about? Okay? The very idea of the violence that is promoted in the media today, and he talks about the 4 different themes of masculinity that are promoted, a violent masculinity, and how that masculinity of that violence, because as his figures I think are 85 to 90% of the violence is committed by boys, okay, by young men, and how in the media it is the men who are promoted, who do all this violence, and how is it naturalized? How is it naturalized? Think of that, okay? In a sense, to answer the question about Dolce & Gabbana and are they selling rape, I would say yes, because rape is not about sex. Rape is about authority. It's not even authority, it's about power. And it's about imposing your power. So yes, in a sense, that's what they're selling. They're selling this power of the man, of men. Okay, and if you think about it, even when those Dolce & Gabbana images sexualized men, was there power conflicts? Was there an imposition, or was it just very much a consensual sexualizing of these men in that ad? And how does that play into all of this? The beauty myth, speaking of Dolce & Gabbana, think of how Naomi Wolf very briefly describes these scenes and how they still, as we saw, play out today. She was talking about the 80s, but it's a recurring theme, and it only becomes more and more acceptable because these images aren't even for men in men's pornography or in men's magazines. These are in women's magazines. So what is it telling? Women's magazines that set a standard for women's behavior and for women's appearance. So what is it telling women? What is it telling women? Okay? Think about how she discusses the commodification of love, which is fascinating. Because what does consumer society need? Consumer society needs constantly growing markets. Consumer society needs consumption. Consumer economy needs manufactured obsolescence, basically. Okay? Think about that, how it's consistently striving to create new to get you to spend your money. And what's it selling? What does consumer society sell you? What did the previous articles talk about before? The next article. The more you subtract, the more you add. Wonderful, actually all these articles, all of your readings, this article talks about how the media and the corporations feed into and sell to young girls' insecurities as they transition into being women. Think of Barbie. Think of why Ruth Handler created Barbie. And she did it for a good reason. God bless her, very well intentioned. But what does that then become? And once it's taken out of the hands of a woman and it becomes just a part of this machine run by men, what then does that become? And when you think about the images of violence against women and the constant demeaning of women, what does that tell young girls? Okay? Finally, we have lady killers. And even here, when women are tough, when women are violent, when women put on that tough guise, if you will, are they naturally violent? Are they still sexualized? What is the one threat that a tough woman faces that a tough man in a violent film rarely, if ever, faces? Okay? For example, think of Casino Royale. That is the closest I have seen. There's the one torture scene that comes the closest in a mainstream film of showing that sort of threat. Actually, the film Deliverance was a mainstream film which did play that threat out against a man. And it's shattering precisely because it's so much an exception. And it wasn't even about violence per se, which makes it even more realistic and depicts the horror of rape. Because again, it's not about sex. And these ads, a lot of times, are not about sex. We are made to think all of this, that it's about sex, but it's really about doing this to men and this to women. It's about creating an imbalance and making damn sure that we all think it's natural. Have a lovely holiday. Bye, y'all.